Hello and welcome to the 39th webinar that has been sponsored by N.A.P.S. Today we're going to hear about the Hearing Voices movement in dialogue with voices with Caroline Mazel-Carlton. Just some housekeeping before we get started. Caroline is a good dear friend of mine, but I always must say the opinions expressed in this webinar are those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect those of N.A.P.S. And we thank you so much for being with us today. We are recording this webinar and it will be available on our website. The chat may appear in the recording, so if you are using the chat function and you don't want your name to appear, you can log out and log back in and put your name as anonymous. We ask everyone to please mute your device and turn your video off so that it doesn't interfere with the screen. On your computer, that will either be in the lower left taskbar or possibly at the top of the page. Again, we'll be using the chat function and I'll monitor that throughout the webinar. You can open the chat in that same taskbar. There's a drop-down menu and you can send a message to everyone that's present or to me or to a specific person by using that send to selection button. Just as a reminder, we do give certificates. This will be 1.5 contact hours. This is only available to members of N.A.P.S. If you wish to have a certificate for your attendance today, please email me. My email's there, membership@inaops.org. I will send you a link to the quiz on this webinar, and when you complete that quiz, I will send you a certificate. If you wish to get a certificate and you're not yet a member, I'd like to invite you to join N.A.P.S. And again, going to our website, inaops.org, you can join and then you're eligible for a certificate for this webinar. And you can also watch all the previous webinars we have recorded. We have recorded webinars from number 11 through today's number 39, and those are available on our website to watch at any time. And you can take a quiz and receive a certificate for those contact hours if you are a member. So without further ado, I'd like to get started today. We're going to be talking about the Hearing Voices movement in dialogue with voices. Our presenter is Caroline Mazel-Carlton. Caroline is the Director of Training for the Western Mass Recovery Learning Community. She promotes an ethos of self-determination and mutual support in a number of settings around the globe. She has been privileged to be a facilitator trainer for the Alternatives to Suicide approach for over 5 years, promoting conversation and connection over the current paradigm of risk assessment. Caroline also works toward developing regional networks of support for voice hearers in her role as training coordinator for the National Hearing Voices Research and Development Project. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Caroline. Thank you.
So for me, the culture which I joined the world in, I was born in a place called Indiana. I don't know sometimes if people have been there or heard of it, but that was a significant part, I think, of my journey. Growing up in Indiana, a culture where, you know, such extreme states weren't ever talked about. It's also not a culture where the place where I grew up, you didn't want to talk about things that were unpleasant. Talking about big feelings was not common. Another thing about the culture I grew up in is it was one that placed a lot of emphasis on authority. For example, you didn't question authority. Definitely not as much as I see people doing here in Western Massachusetts, where I now live. The reason why that's significant for my story, though, is because as a young person, people in authority roles hurt me. So nowadays, as a grown-up, I understand that those experiences were abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. But when I was young, a lot of the times, these were framed as punishments. And in the culture I grew up in, you wouldn't want to tell another adult, like if you were being punished, because you might be in double jeopardy. But as a young person, you know, I was hurt. I saw other kids getting hurt. And oftentimes it felt scary and like I was trapped. And it was into this world that my experiences of hearing voices really began. So I remember very clearly one of my first voice hearing experiences. I was about 5 years old. I was standing by my big bird, big wheel out in the yard, watching a woman who was a caretaker that had hurt me physically and emotionally consistently in the past. I was watching her closely to make sure that she would not hurt me again. And I remember her turning to her friend and saying, "You know, Maureen, there ain't a cloud in the sky today." And very distinctly, right after she said that, I heard a man's voice right over kind of my right shoulder here, clearly say, even though there wasn't a man physically present there, this voice said, "They're liars. They're liars. There are clouds in the sky. I hate them." And for me in that moment, as a 5-year-old in Indiana, I hadn't heard much about hearing voices, but I hadn't been taught to fear it either. So it wasn't that surprising or difficult to hear this voice. The one thing that was kind of compelling about it, though, was that the voice used the word hate. And as a kid, I had been smacked for using that word, like kids weren't supposed to hate things. So there was something about that that really caused me to take notice of this voice, but it also kind of felt like this voice was also there to protect me. And so for those first younger years, on your screens, by the way, that's me, the oldest of 3 kids in a bomber jacket. I still love leather jackets, by the way. So for me at that age, it wasn't that the voices were really that difficult. They made me feel a little bit less alone. And a lot of voice hearers I speak to have a similar trajectory in their life where the voices come, yes, there's tough things going on in life, but the voices themselves aren't really that difficult. However, when things don't get addressed, the traumas that people are experiencing in their external worlds, the voices can become more extreme. And that is the case of what happened to me. So when I was about 8 years old, I'm 36 now. When I was 8, the United States entered into the first American Gulf War. And I think there was something about that experience that I simply couldn't hold. You know, I had people in my family that were in the military. I remember seeing, you know, the night vision footage of the bombs over Baghdad. And suddenly things with my voices really began to shift. They became much louder. They became more aggressive. I started seeing visions that were scary to me. And it was then that I sort of came to the attention of teachers at my school because I wasn't doing well in school. And, you know, a teacher kind of spoke to me and was like, "What's going on?" And, you know, I explained it to her as best that I could. And they said to me, "Okay, Caroline, it's going to be all right. We're going to get you some help." And I was relieved because I'm like, oh, okay, they're going to help me. they're going to help me stop this war. They're going to help me keep the bombs from falling, help me keep kids from getting hurt, and it's going to be okay again. But that wasn't exactly what help ended up being. For me, in the culture in which I was, help meant going to see a medical professional, a doctor. And even though I was 8 years old, I knew why people went to the doctor. You know, you go to the doctor because you're sick, because there's something wrong in you. And that was not the first, I mean, that was the first time I got that message, but it certainly wasn't the last time that I was told, you know, it wasn't external factors in my life. It wasn't this war. It wasn't kids being hurt. That was the true problem. The true problem was in me. And that the solution always seemed to come in pill form. And the pills had various names: anti-psychotic, anti-anxiety, and it kind of felt like, okay, this might be the antidote. This will make the fear go away, the pain go away, the struggle go away. And I would love to say that they worked, but it wouldn't be true. You know, things in my life, things with my voices did not improve. However, you know, that didn't mean, okay, we're going to try something else. It just meant the number of pills that I was taking every morning as a kid just grew, the size, the dosage. But it didn't really shift things with my voices. They did cause me to gain a lot of weight. I had a lot of tremors in my hands. And in a culture like Indiana, where you really want to fit in, where there are these very narrow parameters of what's acceptable, I got bullied a lot. And in fact, as I got older, the number of voices that I was hearing on any given day only began to grow and grow. So I talked about this man's voice. He often was speaking now in really fearful, warning tones. Other voices that I began to hear at this time were two men's voices that, instead of talking to me like that first voice, these other voices would always be talking about me. Never addressing me personally, but always kind of making these predictions about bad things that were going to happen. Sometimes, you know, talking about the things that I was doing at any given moment. It was very distracting, very difficult. It made me feel really self-conscious. Another voice that I began to hear, you know, as a teenager was a voice that I called Miss Cathy, a female voice, very demanding, always called me Missy, would tend to tell me that I was dirty, or be quiet, Missy, sit down, Missy, were some of the things that she would often say. And, you know, I gave a lot of power to her, and often she could kind of keep me in the house for days and days. Another example of a voice very connected, I believe, to a sexual assault I experienced, but when I tried to report, I wasn't believed. I began to hear a voice of a man, different, very different from the other voices I've described. He would tell me that he was going to cut my fingers off one by one. And like a lot of folks, you know, my experience is complicated. It doesn't just involve hearing. When I would hear this man's voice, like I would physically have sensations, like pain in my fingers, and sometimes in other parts of my body. So you can imagine, you know, this was a lot to navigate, a lot to deal with. There was a part of me, though, that always kind of had this sense that there was a way to deal with this beyond just a chemical cure. And granted, I tried a lot. I was certainly prescribed many things, but, you know, I also took that further and used unprescribed substances like heroin to try and deal. Nothing worked well beyond just the short term, though. And there was a part of me that thought there's got to be another way to deal with these experiences. I remember I had many doctors. I didn't lack for medical treatment. And I went to one and I said, you know, I'm having these visions. I told her about a specific vision I was having, where I would see certain people walking around and it looked like they had been harmed, like that they were bleeding from their head. And it was scary, but I'm like, I think it means something. Like maybe it means I'm supposed to be helping these people. And she said to me, you know, Carolyn, it does mean something. What it means is you have a neurodegenerative disease. And if you don't take these, you know, pills to arrest the degeneration, you're going to get sicker and sicker and sicker. And this was just terrifying. And, you know, I saw something pop up in the chat box that validation goes a long way, or validation is important. I totally agree. But unfortunately, a lot of these experiences I was having with supporters were invalidating the reality of what I was experiencing, invalidating the meaning, and also sort of invalidating the fear I had of some of these voices. Sometimes I was just told, you know, it's not real, don't listen to it. So I am someone that has spent a great deal of time in hospital. I'm also someone that still hears voices every day, but my life looks a lot different now than it used to on the locked unit. So what I'd like to speak to now are some of the ways that things have shifted for me, because I believe all of it hinges on this idea of relationship that we talk about a lot in peer support and acknowledge the importance of. So what needed to shift for me were first the relationship with myself, also the relationship with my voices, and finally my relationship with my community. So first off, that relationship with myself. If you're like me and have been on the locked unit, spent a lot of time there, you know it's not really a place where you can build up a strong sense of self. Like, I was literally not allowed to have shoelaces. I slept on a plastic mattress. There would be a guy coming around every 15 minutes, you know, with a flashlight if I was sleeping to make sure I hadn't killed myself yet. It was not a confidence building place. So for me, that relationship with self really began to shift when I was able to move off the hospital unit and I got the incredible opportunity to live on a therapeutic farm instead. So instead of sitting in groups all day, you know, learning about symptoms management or, you know, DBT skills, instead of this farm, you know, I took care of animals. That was the way my day was structured, was get up, take care of sheep and donkeys and chickens. And so when we talk about healing, how relationships can shift the way we see ourselves, I guess what I'll emphasize is those relationships don't always have to be with human beings. Getting up, like, I knew these animals needed me. And being around animals, my voices would get really loud around people because I had been hurt by people, and my voices were holding a lot of that pain, anger, and fear. But animals, it was totally different. Like, we had more of this calmer place of understanding, and I could get some peace for my voices around the animals. And so this was a way that I began to see myself less as just this mentally ill person that lived in a hospital, and more as a person with something to contribute, that these animals needed me, in a way, instead of just me being this internally broken person that other people were trying to fix. So that began to shift a lot of things, with my voices. But there were still ways, in which I needed to come from more of a place of power with some of these experiences. So eventually, I had to move off the farm, and into a group home. And with my voices, as I said, they can hold a lot of pain and fear. So transitions can be difficult for them. And moving to the group home was challenging in a lot of ways. And some of my voices were kind of like keeping me stuck there, just sort of living that group home life of, smoking cigarettes and watching TV. But there was one guy that worked in this group home that, back then they didn't really have peer roles in North Carolina where I was, but this guy acted in that capacity in a lot of ways. And this guy, he took us to see Barack Obama, for example, campaigning in 2008. He also took me to my very first roller derby game. Roller derby, I don't know if anyone's very familiar with it. Martha, if you can switch the slide over, you will see a photo of me playing roller derby, because after I saw my first game, I was like, that's what I want to do. My voices were very excited by the roller derby. Roller derby, if you've ever seen it, it has a lot of big personalities. It's an aggressive sport. And the women that were playing roller derby, were doing things that had gotten me told that I had borderline personality disorder, but they were really being applauded. And there was something about the roar of the crowd, the, intensity of these women that were so different from the women I knew in Indiana, and the way my voices responded, that I just said, that's what I'm going to do. And I was really supported to join this community totally outside of the mental health system, which was a big deal, because back in those days, I could go months at a time without having a single conversation with someone that wasn't paid to talk to me. So joining this team was a big deal, and doing it actually gave me a lot more skills to work with my voices than I had ever been given by the mental health system. So roller derby taught me how to be assertive, how to set limits, and how to come from a place of my own power with my voices. In roller derby, it's significant that you do not skate under your own name, and you're not listed in your own name in the program. You're given a new name. So, when I would skate out onto the track, it's not like the announcer would be like, here she is, bipolar with psychotic features, borderline personality disorder. No. I would skate out onto the track and they would say, here she is, faster than a spinning dreidel. She'll smear you across the track like cream cheese on a bagel. It's number 18, Mazel-Tov cocktail. And people would yell and cheer, and, parents would bring their kids up to me and say, here I was, I lived in a group home, but they would say to me, oh, you're a role model to my daughter. You're a role model to my daughter. And their kids would be like, I play dreidel at my house. And so a lot of these experiences taught me how to engage with my voices in new ways, kind of roller girl style, if you will. So one example, when I first started working in a peer role, it really freaked out my voice, Miss Cathy. And so Cathy would say to me, who do you think you are? Who do you think you are, Missy? Who do you think you are? And finally, one day I turned to this voice and I said, Mazel-Tov cocktail. That's who I am, Cathy. You're on this team. Call yourself whatever you want, but we're getting out there today and we're doing this thing. So learning to set limits with voices, honor them as a part of the team with some perspective to offer, but acknowledging that they can't be the only one in control was super important. And it's something that I use to this day. So that was some of the relationship with my voices, the relationship shifting. I do want to add for me something that I think was really important for me on my journey was to shift also my relationship with chemical substances. So I use one substance called trazodone to sleep 8 hours a night, which is really important for me personally. But I needed to eventually eliminate the use of substances to kind of like get through my day. I was just on way too much stuff. And what I'll offer is I did start hearing more voices when finally, at the age of like 27 or something, I wasn't using substances during the day. I started to hear more voices. But what was important about that was a lot of the voices that I began to hear were positive, helpful. I think that they had been dulled by all the substances I was using. And maybe part of this began with exploring my spirituality by being out there as Mazel-Tov cocktail, this strong Jewish woman. But a lot of my voices took the tone of ancestral and spiritual guides. And that's been a really important part of my life. So I do want to emphasize, for I think most voice hearers really, our non-consensus reality experiences can be very positive, and at times, and we might not want them to go away. We just might want them to shift or to have a shift in the way our community treats us. And so I want to just add, that final piece here about my relationship to my community. And this is really where the Hearing Voices Network comes in. So much in the system, there is such an adversarial relationship to voices. And our pop culture is very cruel to voice hearers. So we need more spaces where voices and the conversation around voices is welcomed. For me, a lot of that came in spiritual community, but what I found is some spiritual communities, they're open to some voices, but like others, they don't quite know how to deal with. So having the support of the Hearing Voices Network that were willing to sit with me and explore the meaning of my voices was critical. And it just provides a lot more peace when you're not having to live this double life as a voice hearer all the time, where there's only like, there's the things you're allowed to talk about, like the weather and sales at Walmart. But then there's like all these other experiences that you have with voices and visions that there's nowhere to go to discuss. And I think we all know how much easier it is to hold something when we're not just holding it all alone. whether it's a relationship with our mother or our boss or a voice, if we can go to a place to talk about it and be heard, and hash it out, we do much better. So I'll share, I do want to share about some of the bigger experiences with voices. So I'll share, about a time in my life where I was hearing a voice that was telling me to kill myself. And it was very persistent and it was very difficult. And the way I at first dealt with it was, we're going to talk more about this strategy, but I turned to the voice and I said, finally, I just acknowledged the voice and I was like, you know what, you're right. You're right. I should kill myself, and I will. But first, I have to read every word of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And this was a negotiating tactic. Because my voice didn't know this, but I was pretty sure, no offense to anyone who is a fan of Tolkien, but there was no way I was going to read 3 books about elves and orcs. So it bought me a lot of time. But eventually, what's really important for me is to be able to go to someone, go to HBN community and talk about the experience. Because what I've realized for myself is when I am hearing a voice that's telling me that I need to die, that my life needs to end, that usually there is something in my life that needs to end. Now, it doesn't mean that my literal heart needs to stop beating, but that there is a role, a relationship, a conception of myself that needs to die so that I can go on living. And we joke about this in HBN groups all the time, about how it would be so nice if our voices weren't so metaphorical, weren't so intense at times, if our voices would just say, hey, Caroline, I think you really need to take a yoga class and maybe work fewer hours. But for most of us, for some, but for most of us, our voices don't communicate in that way. They might use bigger or more provocative language to get our attention, speak in intense metaphors. And so having a Hearing Voices group where we can go to and share, I've had so many groups where I've had other folks offer, I hear that that's your voice's perspective, and I wonder if it might also mean, this. And we can really talk things through. And that has been essential for me. So that's what I'm going to share of my story. What I want to do right now is I want to make sure folks have a little bit of the history of the Hearing Voices movement in general. So if Martha if you could just hit the next slide. The Hearing Voices approach that we're talking about, I just want people to know kind of how it began. Really, the Hearing Voices movement is a human rights movement, like many others, like the LGBTQ movement. And when we see these social justice movements, usually there's a great sort of like watershed moment, like a moment of courage, like when Marsha P. Johnson threw the brick at Stonewall, in the history of the LGBTQ movement. Our movement has a similar story. It's about a woman named Patsy Haga. What I'll offer about Patsy, her life, I relate to it a lot. She started hearing voices about 5 after she was badly burned. And over time, her voices became more aggressive and challenging because she wasn't really given the support that she needed to move through the trauma. And so one day Patsy was, doing long-term time on a psych unit and just so frustrated because her psychiatrist, Marius Rome, kept telling her, don't talk about your voices. They're not real. Don't pay attention to them. Just take a pill. And none of it was working. And so she famously turned to him and said, why is it okay for you to believe in a God that you can't see or hear, and I can't talk about the voices that I do hear. What's the sense in that? And that moment of courage for her really pushed him to say, hey, what's the harm? This woman is saying that she might soon end her life because of this experience. So maybe I can go against my training and start talking about it. And it was really helpful for Patsy to be able to share with Maureens more about the voices she was hearing, more about the things they said, how she viewed them. But one day she also famously said, hey, it's nice talking to you, Maureens, but you don't know a lot about voices, given you don't hear any yourself. Can I please talk to some people that do hear voices? And once again, he became willing. He allowed folks on the hospital unit to get together and share. And it was a huge risk. It went against everything he had been taught. But all of a sudden, there were people on that unit that hadn't been talking for years, all of a sudden laughing and engaging because they were actually allowed to share with each other this whole other part of their lives. So those were really the first hearing voices groups. But Patsy challenged Maureens one last time and said, this is great, but I want to talk with voice hearers that don't live in the hospital. Can you please arrange for that? And he was a little bit stunned because he didn't think there were voice hearers that were out living independent lives. But, you know, so much had paid off already that he took one last leap of faith, and they went on the Dutch version of like the Oprah Show. And Patsy shared her story, kind of like I just shared mine with you. And then they asked people, hey, viewers, if you've ever heard voices or seen visions that others didn't see, give us a call. Call in now, share your story with us. And they thought maybe they'd get one or two people. But instead, they had hundreds and hundreds call in wanting to share their experience just that day. I think 700 people called in. So next slide here. What they realized was there is so much about this experience of hearing voices that we were unaware of. Number one, we weren't aware of how frequent it is. So research out of the movement has finally uncovered that actually 1 in 10 people will hear voices at some point in their adult lives. Rates are higher amongst children. Now, a full third of those 1 in 10, so millions and millions of people, never end up interfacing with psychiatry at all. Either they simply do not meet any type of diagnostic criteria because the experience is so positive, neutral, or accepted, or they find other ways to deal with it that don't involve them ever ending up in mental health services. So this vast number of voice hearers was out there, and no one was talking to them about their experience. But Maureens and his partner Sandra Escher realized there is like untapped wisdom here, and they began to ask more folks about their experience. And what they found was there were some key differences between folks that heard voices and were coping just fine with the experience versus those who were struggling. And spoiler alert, it wasn't that the good copers were taking, pharmaceuticals. The actual data is right there up on your screen. The things that, the types of qualities that people that were coping well had. So good copers, regardless of how they viewed their experience, whether they saw it as satellite transmissions or angels, demons, trauma echoes, what have you, good copers believe themselves to be stronger than their voices. They found ways to develop strength. Good copers were also able to communicate more often about their voices and to their voices as well. We'll talk more about that later. Good copers knew how to set limits with the voices, listen to them, maybe take some time out of their day to listen and engage, and then, go back to what they were doing. Good copers tended to use fewer distraction techniques than the ones that were struggling. And that also includes, drugs to dull the experience. There isn't great evidence that people, pharmaceuticals are good long-term strategies when it comes to navigating voices. And what I'll offer too, again, is these people saw their experience in many different ways. And I just want people to know, I did talk a lot about how my voices connect to trauma and that that's helpful for me. And we'll talk more about that as the webinar goes on. But one does not need to accept a particular framework to live a good life. They did not find that. They found that there were many people coping well that saw their experience as related to extraterrestrial abduction, for example, as long as they had ways to build strength and places to communicate, etc. Next slide. So these are just some key aspects of our movement that are helpful. Acknowledging the reality of the experience and the right to talk about it is huge. Someone already hit on that with validation. Validation is key. If I feel seen and supported, like I am not holding all of this alone, it's a lot easier to navigate. And that can be really simple, guys. Like if someone has a voice that's yelling at them, instead of just being like, that's not real, saying, that's got to be really difficult. I'm sorry that you're having to deal with so much anger in your voice right now. I know for me, it can be really hard to sit with anger. Being vulnerable and validating that reality is so important. Our movement also shows the value of voice hearer driven spaces like we first saw in those hospital units. But also the allies are really important. If allies are willing to be open and acknowledge the reality and the voice hearer's right to interpret the experience in their own way. And then finally, what our movement has really shown us is that voice hearing is not the symptom of biochemical abnormality that we once exclusively viewed it as, but it is a very wide umbrella. Next slide. And this is key, billions have been spent on, genetic brain research over the years. And trying to find, for example, the quote unquote biomarker for diagnoses such as schizophrenia. What I'll offer, I'm not going to go into huge depth, but there's some great resources out there, like, Simon, there's a book called The Science and Significance of Hearing Voices that indicate, that there's actually no evidence of any structural or chemical brain difference among voice hearers that are distinct from trauma survivors. And there was a point when they thought they had found a biomarker, which was distinct from trauma survivors. They were like, oh, okay, so voice hearers tend to have a thinner cerebral cortex. But then what they found out by expanding the research was actually that cortical thinning was caused by the treatment. the cortical thinning was caused by the anti-dopaminergic drugs that are sometimes called antipsychotics. The reason why I don't call these drugs antipsychotics is because for many, many people, they do not function in that way. They do not make the experiences go away. So I think we really set people up, and we're very trauma uninformed when we insist, oh, there's this pill that's going to make your experience go away. It can be really shocking when, you know, you're taking those things and your voices continue. So I would just, as supporters, we need to be honest about what these drugs can and cannot do for people. And we also need to be honest about the side effects. Because, you know, when I was told, you know, that I had a neurodegenerative disease and that I needed to take these dopamine receptor blocking agents to arrest the degeneration, that was not the case. Actually, those agents can cause, you know, loss of brain tissue. And so we just need to be honest with people about, you know, effectiveness and, you know, side effects that can occur. Next slide. The Hearing Voices movement too, you know, we need to make it inclusive. We need to make it culturally competent. So, you know, calling experiences psychosis or psychotic, I would strongly discourage people from using that type of language. I think it can be very limiting. When I call something psychotic, usually, you know, I'm told, oh, you're supposed to take an antipsychotic. You know, and also there's many, many cultures that experience voices and visions and do not view it as pathology. So in our movement, yes, you're going to hear us talk about voices a lot, but not everyone identifies their experience that way. Some folks identify with parts or multiplicity, being many within one body. Some folks view their experience as divine, spiritual, or cultural in nature. And the Tanya Luhrmann study around culture and voices, I think everyone should look at. It's really only the tip of the iceberg, but showed that in certain cultures where voices are more accepted, voices tended to be less threatening. But in the United States, where the relationship with voices is more adversarial, many Americans report voices that are more violent and aggressive than in other places, like in South America or, you know, in the Indian subcontinent. All right, next slide. So as we make space as peer supporters for voices and to shift the relationship we have with voices, there are many open-ended questions that we can use to invite more exploration. And there's just a few of them listed on this slide here. What does our voice say? And how? Does our voice have a gender? How old is the voice that you hear? When did your voice first come along? What was going on in your life when your voice first came along? Building understanding around our voices, our lives, and our experiences builds power. It is one of the most effective strategies we have. So next slide. When we understand something, when we have knowledge, it builds a lot of power. I think it becomes a lot less scary than if we're just viewing it as sort of this like random occurrence that has no meaning and over which we have no control. So as peer supporters, I think it's good to have a broad base of some of the context of voices that commonly occur. So if you're hearing a voice that's 12, I have a voice that's 12. And the age of that voice is significant to me. I believe that he is communicating to me about how there were things that happened when I was 12 that I still need to work through. And he holds some of that. Sometimes he also tries to get me to relax and go out and play. So it also has this sort of like element of reclaiming some of the lost years that I think I had because of trauma. Another very common voice hearing experience is to have a voice echo a negative message that we've received in the past. So healing from some of those past traumas and messages. I know for me, like when I was a kid, like I wasn't able to stand up to some of the people that hurt me. But as you heard, I was able to stand up to the voice of Miss Cathy. And I think part of that was very healing. In fact, you know, I no longer call this voice Miss Cathy. I call her Cathy because, you know, we're shifting that relationship. The most common context of voice is to hear the voice of a lost loved one. Incredibly common. Every time I do a training, you know, someone usually in a clinical role that has never told anyone this before will say, oh my God, you know, my friend's dad, like after he died, comes and visits me. So this is very common. Veterans, very common to have voices that echo war experiences, including enemy combatants. So someone that you have killed in combat, hearing their voice, you know, indicating that there is a lot of veteran, I love the language of moral injury that people use that talk about some of the trauma of being told to do these things by, you know, the government that don't feel morally aligned with your values. Coming back and doing reconciliation and forgiveness work can be really important with some of these voices. Next slide. So protector voices are a big one. A thing to remember, guys, about protector voices, sometimes they feel like protectors, sometimes they feel like nags. Sometimes they can feel a little intense. For some of us, like if we have a voice that's holding a lot of fear or telling us not to leave the house or not to talk to someone, maybe making a lot of controlling demands, sometimes a great strategy with those voices is to soothe them. Sometimes I'll even like physically, by rocking my body, try to soothe the voice and say, it's gonna be okay. We're gonna be safe. I know you're scared. I know we've been hurt in the past, but we have what we need to get through this. So working with voices in this way that are holding this past distress. When folks are having a resurgence of voices or things shift or get really intense, looking at, you know, anniversaries of certain events. Also, cultural and spiritual symbolism is very important with voices. We don't want to negate the power and influence of our ancestry. You know, I remember a young I was supporting on Talk to You Down to the unit. And of course, the psychiatrist wanted to give him, you know, Invega shots. But in speaking with this young man, it wasn't that the eagle was scary in any way what was difficult for him was that he had this sense that the eagle wanted to eat him, or that he was supposed to eat the eagle. I remember him saying that, and it was really confusing. So we did a little bit of exploration. A great resource out there, is the book Spiritual Emergency. But remember there's many wisdom traditions out there, and really learning from cultures at their source is best. But what we found from doing a little bit of research was that this experience of being consumed by a large totem animal is so common sort of across the globe in cultures that anthropologists use this sort of general term for it called shamanic dismemberment. And what it means, if you're having this experience, is not that you need to take more Seroquel. It's an initiation experience. The animal that's consuming you also has significance. And what it tends to mean is you are supposed to serve in a new role in your community, usually a healer role. And so having that knowledge for this young man whose ancestry was West African was really important. And finally, really taking a look at what significant events happened in the year before Voices started. All right, next slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the ways that we can build power in relationship with voices, because we saw how important setting limits can be. Usually not always effective, just telling voices, I banish you forever, go away forever. Though for some people that does work. There are some spiritual rituals, for example, that I've seen be effective for people in that. A strategy, though, to set limits that I've seen be effective in a lot of different scenarios and frameworks is just making an appointment with the voices. So saying, I'll talk to you in 5 minutes, or I'll talk to you at 5 p.m. today. Checking in with your voices in the morning, and then setting a limit and checking back in again later in the day can help people build some faith. Halfway compliance with the voice's demands. You heard that in my Lord of the Rings story, where I said, fine, you're right, I will end my life. Other examples are, if a voice tells you to cut yourself, you can draw on your arm with a red marker. One person I know, her voices, if she gets really stressed out, like voices are incredibly linked to stress for many people. She gets stressed out at work, her voices will start telling her to jump out a window. Instead of jumping out a window, she'll go down and jump off the stoop at her work, and it gets her some relief. Also, if your voice is telling you to punch someone, this has happened to me before, sometimes you can get relief by shaking their hand vigorously, or just setting a limit with that person. So feeling like we can acknowledge our voices, but not to the full and literal extent, is key. Practicing saying no to voices is something you can do as a peer supporter. You can practice just going back and forth, and the person saying yes, and then the person can say no. Or you can play the opposite game where, you say cold and the person says hot. For a lot of folks, particularly trauma survivors, saying no has not been easy. So practicing saying no with a voice, with a supporter can be really great. Also, never underestimate the power of finding out you're not alone to shift relationship. I used to think because I heard voices that were violent or mean, that made me a bad person. And I held like a lot of shame. Finding out I wasn't the only one, and a lot of people that, you know, I looked up to or were a part of the community had the same experience, really shifted the power. Using tools for blocking. We're talking about cultural competence here. You know, there's many cultural and spiritual tools that people use to block phenomena. You know, spiritual phenomenon, sometimes in certain worldviews, running water, you know, keeps spirits away. Sometimes holy water, burning certain sacred woods or herbs, creating a barrier of salt. All of these things have been used as cultural tools to work with spirits that feel damaging. For folks that identify their experience as technologically based, going to certain places where there is no Wi-Fi, or using materials that block electromagnetic waves, such as aluminum foil. Waves cannot pass through that. So this can build a person's sense of power and control to have some of these tools available. Testing a voice's power. I love the story of a woman I know. Her voices kept telling her, you know, we're gonna kill your family. We own you. We are all powerful. And finally, one day she just said to her voice, fine, if you're so powerful, do these effing dishes in the sink right now. And the voices couldn't do it. And they lost a lot of their power. Also, I know of a man who was like concerned about being monitored by like foreign governments. And so what he did was he called his brother and told his brother, you know, I've planted a bomb at this location, which of course he hadn't actually done that. But he figured if he was being monitored that the government would show up at that location, and they didn't. So that also helped him, you know, feel some agency and peace that maybe these voices weren't all controlling. And then, you know, building compassion with voices. You know, as peer supporters, we learn all these different ways to dialogue with people. What I'll offer is, you know, we can use a lot of those same strategies with voices. Next slide. So we don't have like a whole lot of time left. So I just want to touch really briefly on voice dialogue. This is actually talking to a voice. You know, it could be your own, but it could be someone else's. We're going to be talking about just briefly on talking to other people's voices. Just keep in mind like some of the same things that you think when you're peer supporting a person, making sure that there's always consent from both the hearer and the voice. Make sure that you have a good relationship. And, you know, there's always the option, if you're talking to someone's voice for them, to record that, but that should always be for the person. That shouldn't be used, like given to a clinician on a unit, for example. It's really for another person's record and understanding. Next slide. So when I talk with other folks' voices, or when people talk to mine, there's, you know, many different there's different ways we can do this. The main two styles, though, are translator and reporter. So basically, some people, if I'm dialoguing with their voice, they're comfortable just listening to their voice and saying exactly what their voice is saying. Like, you know, a person might be like, "Hi, my name is Little Michael, and I'm really angry today." And I would just say, "Hey, Little Michael, thanks for being willing to talk to me. Is there something in particular that's making you upset?" For some people, that is their preference. Other people like to be more in the driver's seat. So they might say, "Hey, Caroline, I'm hearing a voice named Michael." And I would say, "Oh, great. Can you ask Michael how he's feeling today?" And then they would say, "Michael is telling me he feels a little bit angry today, and it might be because he's been inside too much." So either way, is fine. It really just depends on the individual. Next slide. And these are some example questions. So just like if we're doing peer support, when we're talking to a voice, we want to ask open-ended, non-judgmental questions. You know, it's less about being threatening. Though sometimes there are people that are just like, "Hey, do you mind setting a limit with my voice for me?" You know, there's been times when I've had my husband, for example, just tell some of my voices, "You know, in this house, we respect women." But, you know, in dialogue, we might ask a voice, "What's your relationship like with Caroline?" For example, if it's my voice. And as you can see, these questions, they're fairly neutral. And, you know, sometimes voices, if they have a new audience, might offer new insights as to why they're in a person's life, and what they think is important. And if I know the why of something, it can be a little bit easier to deal with. So as I said before, a lot of these aggressive voices, they are there because they think they're there to protect a person, toughen them up, make them strong, keep them from being wounded again. Next slide. And as we transition out of a conversation with a voice, making sure that we express gratitude to the voice for their willingness to speak to us, and giving time for the hearer to reflect on the experience. Because frequently in a conversation with a voice, because we're a new person joining in to the dialogue, there might be some new information or emotion to process. So voice dialoguing, I think most people, this is totally obvious, but like you would want to make sure that you have some time set aside if, you know, you're going to engage in a conversation with a voice that's not going to be usually like a 5-minute endeavor. Next slide. Another thing that we know is that 90% of people that hear voices are also trauma survivors. Now, we might not necessarily, you know, connect. The voice might not sound like totally connected to a traumatic event that we can name. You know, if I went to a psychic fair, if we all went to a psychic fair, or, you know, a shamanic journeying event where we would meet with many other voice hearers, they would also have higher rates of trauma. That same high elevated rate of past trauma would be a factor among those voice hearers, even though they are not struggling with the experience. So knowing about the different tools that we can use to build power over past trauma is important. You know, I'm not going to go super in depth with this slide, but I really hope if people haven't read, for example, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van de Kolk, that you would read these types of resources, because I think as peer supporters, we don't practice neurofeedback ourselves. We don't give neurofeedback to people. We don't do EMDR. We might not do internal family systems therapy, or be yoga teachers, but we should be able to understand what those things are and let people know that those options are out there. And yeah, I'm not going to go super in depth, but I will say, like, neurofeedback is something that has been life-changing for me and for many voice heroes. Neurofeedback, which is not ECT, by the way, it does not involve any type, although there are electrodes on the head, they are just there to measure your brain waves. There is nothing going in. You get feedback through colors on a screen, colors and sounds. It has been life-changing for me. And for a lot of people, can reduce the frequency of their voices. It hasn't been shown as much to shift content of voices, but finding doing trauma work where we're both talking about traumatic events and also accessing it and expressing the emotions can really help shift content. Voice dialoguing, of course, can shift content too. Next slide. So again, some of this research that's out there and available right now, that shows the factors that, because there's a lot of folks that have had trauma that don't develop voices. So what's the deal with that? Two of the factors that have been teased out are the issues of silence and shame. So if we have a trauma and we don't talk about it, that might be a mitigating factor for later distress. If we have a trauma and we feel ashamed, like personally responsible for it, that could be a mitigating factor as well. So certainly as peer supporters, we want to create environments where, we encourage speaking about past adversity. I just want to put some caution out there for what I see some of this developing, like, trigger culture that I think has moved from social media into, like, sometimes our peer support settings. Sometimes folks are silenced and I think unintentionally shamed when they're told, oh, you can't talk about your trauma here because you might trigger someone. There's less evidence really of that. There's actually more evidence that shows this could potentially be damaging by increasing these factors we don't want, silence and shame. We want people to be able to name and speak to adversity, and also, of course, how it felt, the anger, the fear, the regret, what have you. Next slide. I promise we're going to have some time for questions here. Hearing voices groups are a great place to find this community, this shifting of relationship with ourselves and our voices. Hearing voices groups are places that have a human rights, social justice focus, where people are free to interpret their experiences in any way. There is no assumption of biochemical abnormality in these groups. People are free to talk about anything. You're not like hammered down into one topic, which for voice hearers and visionaries is important because so many of our experiences connect to other aspects of our lives, and where we're free to challenge social norms. Certainly, the social norm that people who hear voices are crazy or pathological, but other social norms that we've challenged in group include social norms around gender, for example, or the social messaging that you have to have a job that makes a lot of money to be a worthwhile person. And essentially these groups, they're not really about treating or fixing people, but really about building stronger communities based on mutual respect, support, and empathy. These groups, next slide, can be found all across the United States. This map is from the website www.hearingvoicesusa.org. So please, refer to that and find out where the nearest Hearing Voices group is in your community so that you can have that information for those you support. If you do not have a Hearing Voices group in your community, feel free to reach out. We do recommend, the HVN USA board strongly recommends a minimum 24-hour facilitator training where we'll go much more in depth than this webinar could. And you will actually get to practice some of the skills that we're talking about. If you need to access training, you can contact me, or you can reach out to info@hearingvoicesusa.org. Also, if you are in a place that does not have a Hearing Voices group and someone you're supporting really is looking for that, we have some online groups that are available. And just reach out to me or the national website, if a person is interested in that. And then finally, last slide, we just want to let people know, you might be a peer supporter in Indiana. I hope there's someone from Indiana on the call that says, hey, I want to advocate for the first full charter Hearing Voices group in Indiana. You can, in your advocacy, say, hey, we don't have these groups in Indiana, but they exist all over the world. This is a global human rights movement, the Hearing Voices movement. And I love sharing that when I've facilitated groups on, locked long-term units, about how when we gather together at this time, we are we're meeting in solidarity with a movement that stretches across the globe. Exciting stuff is that this year, the World Hearing Voices Conference returns to North America and will be in Montreal in November. It travels obviously all around the world, but it's a great place to learn more. If this webinar has piqued your curiosity, there's a lot more out there to be exposed to, and a conference like that one would be a great place to start and get ideas and be a part of the community. That is what I have for you all. So Martha, if you want to let me know if there have been any questions that people want to address or people want to ask them now.
So the one question I saw was asking about resources, and I did put in the chat that we will, when I post this video on the N.A.P.S website, I'll also post a link probably to the Hearing Voices USA website and also a link for resources.
Yes.
And I also put Caroline's email in the chat.
Awesome. Yeah, if you have seen this and you can buy one book, if you have 25 bucks burning a hole in your pocket and you can buy one book, or hopefully your workplace can buy it for you, I would start with Living with Voices, 50 Stories of Recovery, is excellent. And I love how they've structured it all through different folks' narratives. You can learn so much that way. So yeah, I would start there. Certainly, if you have never seen Eleanor Longden's TED Talk on hearing voices, or shared that with voice hearers that you support, definitely become familiar with that. There's also a great video on YouTube if voice dialogue was interesting to you, called Compassion for Voices. That it's like a cartoon about a guy who hears voices named Stuart, and it's narrated by the great Rufus May. So those are places that I might go next. And Rachel Waddingham, Short Thoughts, Getting to Know Your Voices. She talks about strategies she's used, because a number of us, not everyone just hears one voice. Like, oftentimes we're hearing many, and it can be good to sit down and get to know like the qualities and needs of, like, as I said when talking about roller derby, this whole team that we're working with.
Are there any other questions? There was a question about a TED Talk. Is that Eleanor Longden's?
Yeah. Yeah, a great, just a 15-minute video that can spark some really great discussion about the context of voices and, how we build power with them. Any other?
Sorry. I just wanted to, before we close, again, here's Caroline's email. Give you a minute. I should have introduced Caroline a little better. Caroline's with the Western Mass Recovery Learning Community. Their website also has some amazing things. There's a question, Caroline, would you be open to presenting to a group of hospital staff and psychiatrists?
Yeah, this webinar is kind of the quick version. We have many curricula that we offer, from 1.5 hours to 4 days. And we're available to bring them just about anywhere. It takes funding, the Western Mass RLC, like a lot of peer-run organizations. We don't have like a huge budget. So, but if you have an organization with a training budget, we can talk about that. And a lot of times they do this over webinar. So like Skyping into college classrooms or, units, we can schedule, that's usually easier. I was joking with my mother-in-law. She was like, are you going to wear pants for your webinar? Like laughing about how, when you talk this way and connect with people this way, you don't really have to like even be wearing pants, but I am, just in case people are wondering.
And just to close up here, thank you all on behalf of N.A.P.S. And again, if you want a certificate, this was 1.5 contact hours. You need to be an N.A.P.S. member. You can email me at this email or just info@inaops.org. And again, it takes me a few days usually to get this posted onto the website. but it definitely will be up there sometime next week, as well as a PDF of the slides and the link to resources. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Caroline. Martha, can you mention that we have a reduction in price for
Yes.
membership?
We right now have a membership drive going on, and starting today for 3 months, annual membership for N.A.P.S instead of $35 is $25. And we're also going to be announcing soon a special that the first 100 people who take advantage of this discount will be entered into a drawing to win a registration, free registration for the conference in San Diego. So thank you all. Please visit our website for more, and have a good day.